Hi there, Steve Kaufman here, and today I want to talk about how I learned Mandarin Chinese. Now, before we get into that, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe. You can click on the bell to get notifications, and by all means, come and join me at Link to Learn Languages. Now, how I went about learning Mandarin Chinese. First of all, let me tell you that I was 23 at the time. And the reason I started learning Mandarin Chinese is because I was working for the Canadian Government Trade Commissioner Service, and Canada was about to recognize the People's Republic of China. They wanted to train some people in Chinese. I was lucky enough to be selected, and off I went to Hong Kong. Actually, I had a choice of going to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, but I decided instead I would rather go to Hong Kong, which is a Chinese environment, although not a Mandarin speaking environment. So I took about a year to get my level up to what was a sort of British Foreign Service exam, translating newspaper editorials from English to Chinese, Chinese to English. I had to write a diplomatic note in Chinese by hand and obviously speak and translate and so forth. Took me about a year. But the important thing about being in Hong Kong is that it was not a Mandarin speaking environment. So that, my total immersion in Chinese was done without the benefit of being surrounded by people who speak the language. So how was I able to do that? When I think back on it now, the main thing, and I'll go into detail as to how I went about learning, the characters and learning to read and speak. But the main thing was the motivation. And that's the big story. For me, China represented, this exotic world, civilization, culture, and I'll get into more detail on that. But I needed to be very much motivated because it was a lot of work. I had to learn characters, I had to learn the tones, and I was motivated by my interest in the culture. Today, it's much easier to learn languages. We didn't have access to MP3 files. We had great, big, clunky, open reel tape recorders. Most texts had no, obviously you didn't have online dictionaries. You didn't have online anything. Today we have Link, where I learn. I started learning Russian at age 60 on Link. I started learning Arabic and Persian. I'm still learning them. I'm 75. It's just so much easier. The whole, the iPhone, the internet, everything has made language learning easier, including Link, of course. But back then, we didn't have that. So I needed very strong motivation. Of course, today, if you have all of the advantages of learning with modern technology and you're motivated, then you've got the best of both worlds, and you need to be motivated. So to me, the motivation was that here was this ancient civilization, unknown to me, 4,000 years of history. Chinese talk about 5,000 years, but there's 4,000 years in terms of, some kind of record of some government there. And for long periods of history, China was the most developed country in the world, probably up until, 300, 400, 500 years ago. And all of a sudden, this self-satisfied, sophisticated, almost world unto itself, center of the sort of the culture of East Asia, all of a sudden comes into contact with a civilization, Western European, or not necessarily Western, but European civilization that has benefited from the, the science, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and has gunpowder now and has other technical advantages that the Chinese don't have. And they're faced with the fact that they are at a disadvantage. And so here's this new culture. How do you react to it? When I think of, say, the Qing dynasty, which was actually a Manchurian dynasty, but more or less assimilated into Chinese culture. And then in 1911, you have the what they call the Nationalist Revolution. And all of a sudden, it's no longer, an imperial state. It's some kind of republic. But that period from 1911 through to 1949 was, to me, the most fascinating period of China. When I was learning in Hong Kong, we had to read the People's Daily and Mao's thoughts and all of that kind of stuff. And it wasn't very interesting because a lot of the sort of communist boilerplate, ideology and stuff is just a lot of repetition of certain themes that are kind of divorced from reality. But the novels of the 20th century in China, the struggles as intellectuals tried to come to terms with this new civilization and how much of the new civilization should they, accept or integrate into their civilization. What can they maintain of theirs? To me, that must have been an amazing, intellectual struggle. And of course, then there were different, answers. There was the communist answer. There was Hu Shi, more of a liberal answer. There was more of a fascist answer. There were lots of answers, as was the case in many other countries. And I'm discovering that in Arabic or in Persian, when you see 19th century Egypt or 19th century Iran have to deal with this, collision now with these very arrogant Westerners who want to impose their will on these very proud civilizations. So that to me was interesting. So if I look at what I did, first of all, you can see behind me lots of Chinese books, okay? And so I did a lot of reading. I started with this 20 lectures in Chinese culture. And I must admit that, reading about the history of China, 1,500 years ago, or more recently, some of the declarations by Sun Yat-sen, for example, the sort of nationalist revolution, and then, Mao's thought and all of that, reading about it in Chinese was very exhilarating for me. I followed that 20 lectures book up with, and I should say that before I got into that, before I started reading, we had this, where I went to school, New Asia College in Hong Kong, Kowloon side. It was part of the Yale in China program. And there's so many books in the Yale in China program. And the starter book for them was Chinese Dialogues, which was a series of dialogues spoken rapid fire, or so it seemed to me. And they used their own transliteration system. It wasn't the pinyin. So I became accustomed to words and sounds for a good, I think, 2 or 3 months before we started into reading and learning the characters. Once I had some characters, then I could get into the 20 lectures in Chinese culture, although we had no audio for it, which is unfortunate. And also this intermediate reader in Chinese, modern Chinese, lots of emphasis on patterns. And to me, the secret to learning Chinese is don't use a traditional dictionary because it's very time consuming. And you'll forget, in any case, any dictionary, once you close the dictionary, you've forgotten what was there. But with the Chinese dictionary, and I got lots of them, it takes so long to look a word up, it's a complete waste of time. I only dealt with reading material where there was a glossary behind each chapter. Of course, nowadays, that's no longer necessary because you have online dictionaries. And so if you're reading a link, you can look up words immediately. You can save them to a database. There's so many more things that you can do now that weren't available back in those days. But so the first thing is, don't use a traditional dictionary, which today you don't need to do. And the second thing was, don't get tied up in grammatical explanations, because the grammarians try to get in there and create all kinds of terms and stuff. I never looked at any of that stuff. I dealt strictly with patterns. Here's how they say it. Here's how we say it in English. Here's how they say it in Chinese. And if I do enough reading and eventually enough listening, I will get used to those patterns in Chinese without worrying about grammatical explanations. I did want to show you, as I say, passion is part of it, obviously. And I liked the characters, and I had these 1,000 flashcards with what's known as the radical, which determines, the sort of the meaning of the character to some extent, was in red, and I went through those. I had sort of a self-styled spaced repetition system that I used. But eventually, of course, you come to terms with the tones. And it's very difficult to remember the tones of individual words. So I listen to a lot of xiangsheng, and I have a lot of CDs of xiangsheng. I just grabbed a few here. My favorite is Ho Balin, and I wasn't able to grab one of his. But these xiangsheng are comedians. It's like a comic dialogue, and they exaggerate the pronunciation as they're trying to be funny. And I just found them, especially Ho Balin, it was almost like listening to music.
初学写作呀，
这人
谦虚，
什么谦虚？
好像我是在那个什么什么杂志上看过你的作品。
是吗？
嗯，
在什么刊物上看见过？
是这个哦，中国妇女。
中国妇女啊啊！
That helped me with my tones because you have to get the tones inside a phrase of some kind. So if I hear these tones, these phrases bouncing around in my brain, it helped me. Even though the Xiangsheng comic dialogues contain a lot of references to historical characters or to literature and things of that nature that I didn't, had no idea of. So I didn't understand them that well, but it was the music of those dialogues that helped me. So that was the other thing that was very useful for me in learning tones, is to do a lot of listening to that kind of material. Now, I have here 2 boxes of CDs, of which I haven't yet had time to listen to. I kind of set them aside, Hong Lo Meng, and I don't know how many CDs, and I've got, countless Xiangsheng CDs and historical CDs, and there's so much stuff. And of course, nowadays, you don't even have to go. I used to go to, when I was traveling into China, in 2003 maybe, when I went there to promote my book. So I bought all this stuff. But now, of course, you can go online and you can find YouTube videos, which, by the way, you can import into Link with the subtitles, and that becomes a lesson. And so there's so many more things that you can do that I couldn't do back in those days. So just to summarize, and I would recommend that you check out the video that I did on how I learned French. And that was, of course, the first, call it, language that I wanted to learn to a level of fluency. And compare that to my experience with learning Chinese. And you'll see that the common denominator is that I developed a passion for certain aspects of Chinese civilization, of French civilization. And that's what sort of drove me to overcome the obvious difficulties. And the difficulties are not insurmountable. Chinese, for example, has the advantage that once you have characters, it's easy to build vocabulary, because they are new words, in the way we understand words, are combinations of different characters. The grammar in Chinese is, if I compare it to Slavic grammar, it's very, very straightforward. But you have to learn the characters and you have to tackle the tones. So with each language, there are difficulties. To overcome these difficulties, you have to basically have a passion. And I'm not going to speak in Chinese today, but you could refer to some of my videos where I have had discussions in Chinese. Yeah, I've maintained it. And even though I don't have much occasion to speak Chinese, I think I speak Chinese better today than when I wrote my exam back in 1969, even though I was able to write then, and today I would have a lot of difficulty. In fact, I can't write by hand in Chinese. I can write on the computer, but back then I could. But today, because I occasionally revisit Chinese and I listen to CDs and content, and we have Chinese friends here in Vancouver, I think I speak better now than I did back then. So there you have it. I'm kind of rushing through it, so I don't want this video to be too long, but that's a brief sort of introduction on how I learned Mandarin Chinese. Thanks for listening.